What's going on, guys? So in this session, we're going to be continuing with our GCSE Psychology lecture series. We're going to be looking at structures of memory. So what is memory? So according to the Dictionary of Psychology, produced by Oxford University Press, memory is the psychological function of preserving information involving the processes of encoding, storage, and retrieval. Key processes include encoding, so that's transforming sensory information into a form that can be stored, or sensory input. So input from our senses are sight, smell, taste, touch, and hearing. Storage, so of course holding on to those and maintaining that information over time. And retrieval, so going and getting it when we need it. What are the different types of memory? So we've got sensory memory. It's a brief storage of sensory information. So very, very brief. So if we touch something, or if we smell something, or if we see something, or if we taste something, that very brief interval is a very, very short period of time, which is our sensory memory. So remember, we looked at this previously in previous models. Short-term or working memory. This holds information temporarily for manipulation, so we can decide on whether we're going to focus on this and consolidate it to long-term memory, or if we're going to forget about it. Now, of course, our long-term memory, it stores information for long periods, potentially an entire lifetime. We've got a really good memory. The information processing model. So what does this look like? In essence, it's input, encoding, storage, and retrieval. Very similar to memories that we've looked at, memory models that we've looked at previously. So what's the link when it comes to neuroscience? The idea of neuroplasticity. That's something that you guys need to remember. Neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to change physiologically when it learns new information, so creating new connections amongst the neurons. So the brain's ability to change through the creation of new neural links and pathways made between neurons in reaction to learning. Synaptic transmission. This is the process of information through neurotransmitters between our neurons. So the role of neurotransmitters in sensory information processing. Sensory memory. So different types of sensory memory, what are they? We've got iconic memory. So visual sensory memory, retention of visual images for roughly 500 milliseconds. Echoic memory, so think of echoes, sound, audio. So auditory sensory memory lasts 2 to 4 seconds. So this is all based on neuroscience, or the study of the brain, right? So sensory memory involves primary sensory cortices. Example, the visual cortex for iconic memory and the auditory cortex for echoic memory. And those have been highlighted on the image that you guys can see on screen now. Short-term memory, or STM, and working memory. So characteristics, short-term memory has limited capacity of 7 items plus or minus 2. It's a very short duration of only, say, 20 seconds. Our working memory is more dynamic than short-term memory, is used for active processing and manipulation. So when we're actually concentrating and actually thinking about those, the information that we've been brought in and the information that we're focusing on within our short-term memory. What is the neuroscience of short-term memory? Well, it involves the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, and other brain areas. Neuronal activity in the prefrontal cortex represents temporary information storage. Long-term memory and the brain. So we have explicit or declarative memory. Things such as episodic memory. So episodic memory, if you think of things like episodes, like the episode of your favorite anime. These are things like personal experiences or events. If you think back to your first day of secondary school or your first day of college, and these kind of experiences, these are known as kind of episodes or episodic memory. As I said before, think of it like an episode. Semantic memory, simple things like facts and general knowledge, like what's the capital city of the country that you live in. Implicit or non-declarative memory. So we've got things like procedural memory, so procedures that we remember, things like riding a bike, skills and habits. What is priming? Priming is the influence of recent experiences on our behavior. And conditioning, these are things that we'll look at when we look more towards the social side and social aspects of our curriculum. But things like classical and operant conditioning. In essence, if you take a neutral stimuli and we condition ourselves to have a trained response to that stimuli. So you guys will look at Pavlov's salivating dog, and which was a study, it's not some weird analogy, it's actually a study that was conducted, and operant conditioning, so actually going through operations to get a desired outcome. The hippocampus. The hippocampus is crucial for converting short-term memories into long-term memories. Again, hippocampus, you can see that shown on screen. It plays a massive role in spatial memory, so things like place cells and the cognitive map. Our amygdala, where our emotional memories are processed, and enhances retention of emotionally charged events. So the amygdala is you'll always hear the amygdala being spoken of when it comes to things like emotion. It's part of the limbic system in our brain circuitry. Interaction with the hippocampus to tag emotional significance, so they work together. The cerebral cortex, storage of long-term memories. Semantic memories spread across areas. Episodic memories encoded in more specific regions. The cerebellum and the basal ganglia. These are critical for procedural memories, things like motor skills and habits that we develop. The neural basis of consolidation. Synaptic plasticity, so all to do with what we spoke about slightly earlier, those neural connections, increasing our brain plasticity, allowing those new neural connections to be created through synaptic transmission. Strengthening of synapses during memory formation. So we will look more at this when we look at neuropsychology later on in the videos. Long-term potentiation, LTP. It's a neural mechanism for learning and memory. Primacy and recency effects. So the serial position effect, what is that? Quick definition is that it's the tendency to recall the first and last items in a list better than the ones in the middle. So as you can see, just by this image that we can see here on the right, if we imagine those are a list of items that we try to remember, the things that we learned at the beginning of the list will be easier for us to recall, as well as the things at the end of the list, but the things in the middle, we may start to lose those. There are two factors. The primacy effect, and what is that? That we have better recall for items at the start. Items at the beginning are rehearsed more because we have more time to rehearse them, more time to think of them, more time to kind of say them over in our minds. They enter long-term memory through greater processing. So remember the levels of processing model that we looked at in the previous video. We have in essence more time to process these on a deeper level. It relies on long-term memory. So because we're going into our long-term store and it's been consolidated into long-term store, then it relies on that long-term memory. The recency effect is the flip side of that. Better recall for items at the end. Why? Because they were the last ones that we recalled, so they're still in our short-term memory. It's easy to retrieve immediately, like right after the information is presented to us. And this relies on our short-term memory. So the primacy effect, greater level of rehearsal, and we rely on our long-term memory for that, whereas the recency effect relies on our short-term memory. Hermann Ebbinghaus, 1885. He pioneered research into memory, introducing the idea that memory retention follows a pattern. He conducted experiments on himself with nonsense syllables. He discovered the forgetting curve and the serial position effect, which is what we just discussed. Murray Glanzer and Anita Kunitz, 1966. They designed a famous experiment specifically targeting the serial position effect. Participants were presented with a list of words, immediate recall versus delayed recall, and they also introduced a distraction task. when the list was recalled immediately after the test had been conducted, then there was strong primacy and recency effect. So participants remembered words from the beginning of the list and the end of the list far better. With delayed recall, so when there was a 30-second delay, what do you guys think happened? I'll tell you what happened. Recency effect diminished, but the primacy effect remained. So remember, the recency effect relies on our short-term memory. So because that 30-second delay has happened, our recently recalled information starts to disappear. But because we've had time to process the words at the beginning of the list for longer, our primacy effect remains. The serial position curve. So as here we can see an example of what that would look like. So the serial position curve, graph showing recall probability for items by their position, is typically U-shaped. Mechanisms, things like attention, rehearsal, and decay. So attention, early items receive more focus. Rehearsal, repeated mental practice enhances encoding into long-term memory. Decay, middle items suffer from lack of rehearsal and decay from short-term memory. So those middle items, they don't get rehearsed like the things at the beginning of the list do. Thus, we start to lose them and we get this U-shaped curve. Murdoch's serial position curve, 1962. What was the aim of this study? So Murdoch wanted to investigate the serial position effect and provide evidence for the existence of separate short-term and long-term memory stores. What was his procedure? Participants were presented with a list of words, typically 20 words. Each word was shown for about 1 to 2 seconds. After the entire list, participants were asked to recall as many words as possible in any order. This is called free recall. Yeah? So remember that free recall, you don't have to try and remember in the order that you saw it. Murdoch varied the number of words and presentation time in different versions to test the reliability of this. What were his findings? Well, we found that recall was best for the first few words, the primacy effect. So remember, those had more time to be rehearsed. Recall was also good for the last few words, so that's the recency effect. Recall for words in the middle of the list was much poorer. So again, we're seeing that U-shaped curve. When the data were plotted, the results formed a distinctive U-shaped serial position curve. If a distraction task was added before recall, example, counting backwards from 30 seconds, the recency effect disappeared, but the primacy effect remained. So what's the evaluation of this? This is our guy Murdoch right here. Strengths is that it was highly controlled laboratory study, so it had high internal validity. Replicable, so similar results found across many different studies. Clear support for the multi-store memory model, so remember we looked at that in our previous video. What were some of the limitations? Well, it's an artificial task, so recalling word lists, and it lacks ecological validity. Remember, ecological validity means that it represents the real world. Not all memory tasks behave in the same way. Example, remembering stories or real life events. Just a quick look at what the serial position curve could look like. So, quick conclusion. Memory recall is influenced by where an item appears in a sequence. Primacy relies on long-term memory processes, whereas recency relies on short-term memory processes. Murdoch concluded that memory involves two separate stores: a short-term memory store that explains the recency effect, and a long-term memory store that explains the primacy effect. His findings supported the multi-store models of memory, things such as Atkinson and Shiffrin's model, 1968. I hope this gives you guys a better understanding of the serial position effect. It's definitely something that will potentially appear in your GCSE memory section on paper 1, so make sure that you guys revise that. Catch you guys in the next one. Peace.